Well, I'll start with an introduction. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Paul Brame. I'm the current commander of the 8th SOS. Now, it's an honor to be sitting here with you today, sir, given all that you've done for the SOF community, SOF Aviation, the 8th in particular. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity to kind of talking to you about some of the things you've experienced as a commander, as a leader, and ultimately as an airman in SOF. So if you don't mind, would you start with a brief introduction of who you are, where you're from, and how you came by the Air Force?
Sure thing. Born in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, Cajun country. Taught by nuns, had very little vocation guidance in high school. My first cousin was in the Air Force. That sounded good enough for me. So I went through ROTC, got my commission. My college major was electrical engineering. Went to Reese Air Force Base for pilot training. And at that time, there were only one base that had fighter assignments. That was Webb, because they had just gotten the T-38.
Okay.
So the other bases didn't have fighter assignments, so I chose the C-130. And the squadron I went to was the ski model C-130 that flew in the Arctic. So it was a C-130D, which meant it was an A model with skis. So I was in that squadron for 5 years, 3 years at, 2 years at Dyess, 3 years at Elmendorf, because Alaskan Air Command wanted ski model C-130s, and finally they got them.
Right.
So I have a lot of ski landings on the Greenland ice cap supporting radar sites, JATO takeoffs, that kind of stuff. And then when it was time for assignment, I had a strange assignment to a squadron that had existence was top secret, and that was a drone reconnaissance squadron. In those days, satellites weren't very good, so we had to rely on film photography that had to be processed, not electronically gathered. So SAC had a squadron of C-130s that launched drones to take photos. So that's the squadron I went to after the Alaskan assignment, and spent 4 years there, got 110 missions in Southeast Asia, launching drones into North Vietnam, South China, that area. Involved in the Sante raid from a photographic intelligence gathering standpoint.
Okay.
The existence of the POWs at Sante was discovered by drones. And then we had to try to get a drone right over the target right before the mission. And I was involved in that surge activity doing that. Then the Air Force said, we need a bunch of astronautical engineers. So they sent me to graduate school at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. 2 years of grueling academic study. And by the time I graduated, NASA had all the space assignments. So the Air Force says, what can we do with you? You're overeducated for most jobs. I said, send me to Eglin Air Force Base to any job. So I went to the Tactical Air Warfare Center, because at that time, the Vietnam War was winding down, and the Air Force didn't know what to do with all these assets and people from the Vietnam War, so they put them into centers to do test and evaluation. So I was the special operations test and evaluation guy throughout most of the 70s with very little work, because the Air Force didn't really have any money for special ops, no emphasis. So I did a little bit of everything. For instance, I ran the test to feel the rubber rating craft that drops out of a C-130 with the SEALs. I ran that project, and a few others like that. I did other things like chem defense, life support. So after about 7 years at the Tactical Air Warfare Center, known as TALK at Eglin, because I was in TAC and a squadron that was kind of, or an organization that was kind of strange, the squadron commanders list came out, and in TAC there was a list for fighter, there was a list for reconnaissance, and there was a list for cats and dogs. Miscellaneous TAC entities. Special ops was in there, so I came out on the squadron commanders list. And I was easily interviewable across town at Hurlburt. So I got the job to command the 8th, went PCS across Fort Walton Beach to Hurlburt. Took command of the squadron in May of 1979 as Commander number 104.
Okay.
And then, of course, all hell broke loose in November when the embassy fell. And I was curtailed. I didn't serve my full 24 months because one of the corrective actions of the failure of the Iran mission was, of course, the formation of JSOC at Fort Bragg. And because I had been the commander of the 8th and also probably the chief fixed-wing planner of the second attempt to rescue the hostages, I was selected to be the first chief of air operations at JSOC. So I went there for 3 years. And then by that time, the Air Force said, hey, we need a test and evaluation organization for special ops. So it was formed at Hurlburt. It was called SMOTEC, Special Missions OT&E Center. So I ran that organization until I retired after 26 years.
Okay. Can you talk to me a little bit about what was the 8th SOS doing before Eagle Claw? So when you took command in May of '79, what did you know about their mission? What attracted you to be effectively a soft commander? And what was the day in the life of an 8th SOS airman before the embassy fell and you were tasked to support Eagle Claw?
Yeah, you have to understand that the condition after the Vietnam War. We had a pretty good special ops capability, but when the war ended, anything that had the word special got decimated. And the Air Force didn't really know what to do with special ops.
Right.
They really didn't know what to do with it. So they said, well, we put it in Tactical Air Command. So these few assets left from the Vietnam War were sent to Hurlburt in a wing that was part of 9th Air Force of Tactical Air Command. Headquarters TAC and 9th Air Force didn't know what we did at Hurlburt, didn't care. Okay? So we had very few assets. Like the squadron normally on a day-to-day basis maybe had 2 airplanes we could fly, maybe 3, and we had to run the combat talent school within the squadron. So it was sort of a dead-end assignment, but from a C-130 standpoint, it was the cream of the crop of pilots and crew members that were in special ops flew the C-130. So it was a challenge to keep the squadron morale high with so few airplanes, not getting much flying time, etc. And of course, the other squadron was the gunship squadron, and then we had a helicopter squadron. So the base was much different then. All the buildings were painted blue because we had a wing commander that was quite a character named Dick Dunwoody. So all of the buildings were painted blue, and he loved parades in review. So we actually had events in a big open field where the squadrons would have to march in parade in review. And I would always cry foul because the C-130s in the gunship squadron were used to going in a left-hand orbit all the time, and I claimed that to be a disadvantage to the other squadrons because they were used to being in a left-hand echelon or whatever. But anyway, he loved parades.
Okay.
And when I say 9th Air Force and TAC really didn't care and know much what we did, that turned out to be a pretty good advantage when the embassy fell. Because you'll probably get into this, but the communication basically was from the Pentagon down to the 8th SOS, bypassing all intermediate commands, telling us, hey, we're going to send you something called night vision goggles. Right. They're the first generation. They ain't very good, but go learn how to use them, as an example. So Hurlburt was very different then.
Right. What made the 8th SOS and Special Ops special back in the 70s and 80s? So after Sante and kind of some of the things they did, and how was the 8th different than what a traditional C-130 squadron would have been, maybe what you flew when you were at Anchorage flying on skis?
Well, as you know, the C-130 has been modified to do lots of things.
Yeah. And
the mission of the 8th, infiltration, exfiltration, resupply, all the equipment, it just made it a special airplane, and a lot of people that liked the C-130 had flown slick models, gravitated to try to get into special ops. And in my case, I had not flown for about 8 years, combination graduate school and being in the Tactical Air Warfare Center, so it was quite a challenge for me getting my proficiency back up, and that was greatly interrupted by the embassy falling.
Right.
But the environment at Hurlburt was sort of kind of a dead end for most lieutenant colonels that were assigned there. No promotions. We had no Air Force generals in special ops. The highest, in fact, we had none in any service. The highest rank of a special operator at that time was an Army colonel in the Pentagon in the office called J3 SOD Special Ops Division. Had a staff of about 3 or 4. And what he did was he was the keeper of the Santé report, the keeper of the whatever, and whatever exercises were being conducted that had special ops input, then that his office ran that. But that was an Army colonel. That was the highest ranked special operator. Of course, now we have 4-star. So that kind of gave you an idea of what the emphasis was on special ops in those days.
Yes, sir.
Just no money, no emphasis. For instance, I was the one that was going to conduct any kind of test and evaluation on special ops for those 7 years in the Tactical Air Warfare Center. In 1977, the gunships almost went to the boneyard. In other words, they were going to say, we don't need gunships, let's send them to the boneyard. One of the projects I tried to get organized was to button up the gunships and let them be pressurized for long-range development or long-range deployment. And there was no money for that. We had to abandon that. So that's typical of what was going on at that time.
Yes, sir. So all that changed then in November of 1979 when the embassy fell. When you were tasked with this and when you were brought into the fold, what was your initial reaction? How did you feel about the mission set, about what you were being asked to do? And when you mentioned not having resources, having just a few airplanes, what was your initial reaction?
Well, the way it happened basically is we were watching the news, then all of a sudden the deputy for operations for the 1st SAL leaves. Doesn't tell anybody where he's going. He was sent to the carrier, okay, to babysit helicopters if they ended up there. Then my assistant ops officer in the squadron also left all of a sudden. People in the Pentagon were calling people in squadrons to come to the Pentagon to help the Delta Force, which had just been formed, try to put together a mission. So the initial calls from the Pentagon bypassed me as the commander of the 8th and went to my ops officer, because the guy in the Pentagon knew the ops officer, didn't know me from whatever. And the instructions at that time was only the actual people that would fly a mission could be read into what they were getting ready to do. That didn't work very well, because I'm the commander of the squadron and I have people that are at night going out with a box that had night vision goggles in it. We didn't know what they were. And they'd have to crew rest during the day, and Pentagon would say, hey, tonight we need to do something different. How do I contact? I said, well, they were in crew rest at home because they're flying tonight. So finally, Colonel Kyle, who was designated the Air Force component commander, said that won't work. So he put me in charge of the fixed wing portion of the Hurlburt effort. And from then on, what we basically did is we set up a JOC, a Joint Operations Center, on the top floor of Easton Hangar. I was told to run it, pick 3 or 4 people from the 8th as additional duty, and we got a device that could take a phone line and encrypt it called Park Hill. Mm-hmm. And we had a teletype, and we set up a JOC in Easton Hangar to coordinate with the Pentagon, bypassing 9th Air Force, bypassing headquarters, TAC, bypassing everybody. So on a day-to-day basis, the commands would come from the Pentagon to now, tonight go train with this Delta operation, or tomorrow night go develop this tactic or whatever. So we had the ops officer from the squadron, running the squadron and flying as well. And then I was running the jock at Eastern Hangar. And that became a fixture in special ops at Hurlburt for many, many years. It was referred to as DOS, Deputy Operations for Special Activities. So that was the contact point with the higher headquarters in the Pentagon. Because a decision was made early on in the Pentagon that whatever response there would be for the Iran mission would be like Sante, in that it would be a joint task force ad hoc built for that mission. And part of that had to do with the personality of the chairman. Chairman Jones, at that time, was the kind of guy that would want to come and look over the shoulder of the planners and find out what they were doing. So there's no way that the mission would have been given to one of the unified commands or the combatant commands. It had to be planned right there in the bowels of the Pentagon. So that complicated matters because the Pentagon's not supposed to be a combatant command. I mean, it's not supposed to be, but they made it work, just like the Sante mission, in that a joint task force was organized to coordinate all the activities within the bowels of the Pentagon. Room 2C840, that's where it was. So back in the squadron, I didn't spend much time in the squadron. I was always in Eastern Hangar, getting instructions from Colonel Kyle in the Pentagon, coordinating this training for tonight, this training for tomorrow night, trying to help develop tactics, because we were probably the most qualified people in the Air Force to do this mission, but we still had some challenges because we were told from the very start, whatever we do is going to be in total darkness, total radio out, whatever. And the other thing that complicated the situation at Hurlburt is that the initial reaction to the Iran crisis was punitive, not rescue. Which means the Pentagon said, well, we need something to get the attention of the Iranians to force them to release the hostages. So we're going to use gunships on a long-range mission and bomb the hell out of them as a attention getter, so that if you don't release the hostages unharmed, this will continue. So everybody at Hurlburt that had any command authority left. The wing commander, everybody was gone. So we had a deputy wing commander that didn't know much about special ops, and a brand new squadron commander that hadn't been flying C-130s for 8 years, 9 years, running things. We had to learn as we went. So it was a challenging time, but we got through it.
You've mentioned a lot of challenges, sir, from lack of resourcing, being asked to develop new techniques and procedures, even new hardware. You talk about the squadron level, you're doing that with NVGs, with the landing lights and making them NVG compatible. Of all those, what was your biggest challenge, and how did you as a commander lead your squadron to overcome that?
My biggest challenge was I was an outsider. I didn't come up in the ranks of C-130 Special Ops, pilot, IP, whatever. I was a staff guy across town at Eglin, running projects dealing with chem defense, life support, special ops, what little there was. And I really never had the chance to really establish my proficiency or reestablish my proficiency as a pilot. Although the missions I flew in Southeast Asia were basically special ops missions. The profile, at least, would take off out of Benoit with a green light from the tower at 4 in the morning with drones hanging from under the wing of the C-130. Mm-hmm. And we would be in total radio silence. We'd enter the traffic pattern at Da Nang and then peel off and go down to 300 feet without terrain following gear and sneak up and launch a drone in the North Vietnam or South China. So the profile was special ops, and I had 110 such missions. So I had a feeling for those kind of profiles, but the the situation was I was an outsider, so that was my biggest challenge. So I had a choice. I mean, as commander, I could have said, fly me every day and get my proficiency back because I want to be one of the pilots on the mission. I didn't do that. I followed the directions of Colonel Kyle, who recognized what my strengths were, what my weaknesses were, and he said, you go run the JOC, the Joint Operations Center at Eastman Hangar, and you talk to me every day, and I'll tell you what to do as far as setting up training and whatever. And the other thing that was unique is that I have 2 engineering degrees, so I had a little feeling for how to develop equipment, what to do. Let me just give you an example. When we were getting ready for one of our exercises, a Delta operator appears in my office with an antenna. He said, Colonel Guidry, this is a Dorn-Mogollon satellite antenna. And nobody has satellite radios on their airplanes except the Doomsday airplane, okay? And our task force commander wants you to mount this on the lead airplane that's going to be on the mission to rescue the hostages. I said, well, that airplane's in the Pacific right now because we undoubtedly will use FLIR-equipped airplanes as the lead airplane, but it ain't here. He said, well, he wants to test satellite communications immediately. I said, well, we can mount it on one of our C-130s at Hurlburt, but that's not satisfying his direction. Let me look at the antenna. And I looked at it, and sure enough, it was a little smaller than the overhead escape hatch hole. I said, what if we take that antenna and mount it on a overhead escape hatch so we could insert it from within the airplane and then move it when we need to because all the hatches in the C-130s are all the same size. Okay, how do we do that? Well, we attach it and we get on to an airplane and we fly at 150 knots and see if it stays together. Then we increase 20 knots and we see if it stays together. And eventually we get the normal airspeed and our mounting job worked. So that was the beginning of hatch-mounted antennas used in the Air Force for tons of years.
Up until today still.
So that's an example of the environment of us having a carte blanche to test and to develop that reap benefits for the Air Force for many years.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's just a typical example of what we dared to do in those days. And of course, the development of air fuel seizure and blackout landings is, I could write a book on that alone.
Yes, sir.
To, yeah.
Right, so I want to kind of fast forward to the actual mission. So you've done all your training locally. You get the planes, the equipment, the men are ready, and you're called upon to execute. Can you kind of run us through briefly what was execution like? What were you feeling during the execution? Did you feel prepared? Did you feel like it was really risky, like you were set up to fail, or did you feel like you had the skills and the people and the equipment to succeed?
One of the biggest problems we had leading up to the mission was the fact that our guidance from the Pentagon was, if they put them against the wall and start shooting them, we're going in with whatever capability we have. But the other track would be to go in when conditions are best for us. So you have to understand, in those days, you had to wait for the moon to be there to use night vision goggles effectively. Now it's a different story, as you know. So we had a dual track preparation. We had to be ready to go immediately, but still prepare for a more planned, organized, when we want to go type mission. And Jimmy Carter, probably the only criticism I have of him in this mission was that he waited too long to try diplomatic efforts to solve the problem. And we kept telling him, not personally, but he kept being told, we have to find a location in the desert where the sand will support the C-130s at those horrendous gross weights. But what do we do if he tells us to go right away? We have to have an option to seize an airfield where we know we won't sink to our wings. So we rehearsed everything like we're going next week. So that was probably the biggest problem we had, because the reconnaissance mission to reconnoiter the Desert One site didn't occur till April 1st. We went April 24th. And the results came back, yes, it will handle a C-130, we think. So the flow of airplanes was organized for 6 C-130s to be 1 hour between number one and the other 5. In case number one got stuck in the sand, not all 6 would get stuck in the sand. So those were the challenges we had, rehearsing for an immediate mission, but hoping that we would have the more deliberate mission when we were ready to go. And the other thing that was a factor is that the temperatures were getting warmer in March and April, and the helicopters and the C-130s were operating at such horrendous gross weights that if it got much warmer, we couldn't operate. The helicopters couldn't operate in the warmer temperatures. So Jimmy Carter was faced with the challenge in that Ronald Reagan was becoming a viable alternative, and Jimmy Carter knew that probably by March or so, his only chance for re-election was a successful rescue mission. So finally, and that's my criticism, I wish he would have decided earlier to let the reconnaissance mission occur and let us plan for the more deliberate mission when the moon was right, when the temperatures were not too hot yet. But anyway, those were the challenges. The other big challenge in the squadron was what every commander faces. You know, you have mission hackers and you have those that kind of hide behind the tech manual. And I had to rely on my ops officer because I didn't know the personnel well enough, being a new guy, as to who to select for the mission. So I made permanent friends and I made permanent enemies in the selection process. Now, the ops officer made the selections, but I had, as the commander, overall veto power as to who flew in the mission. So those were issues dealing with the mission. So when it got time to deploy, we ended up with a squadron that had enough to form 9 crews, but were only needing 4. Now, we didn't fly with hard crews. We just chose people that we thought were the right people for the mission. So that was the pressures on a commander as to how to organize and deploy his squadron for best advantage. You have to look at whatever is the best combination of people, equipment, etc., that will accomplish the mission as assigned to you. So we had, of course, 2 squadrons involved, the 1st SOS, and they supplied 2 crews. We used their airplanes for number 1, 2, and 3 because they were FLIR equipped. And the gross weights we were operating at were horrendous. Let me just give you an example. In order to penetrate Iranian airspace, number 1 went by himself, which I was on. So did number 2. Number 3 was a Combat Talon 1 that flew a diamond formation with the other 3 airplanes, which were fuel carriers. They were C-130s that happened to be air refuelable, that had the bladders in the back for the fuel. Their gross weights were 195,000 pounds. Now, what does that mean to you as a OB-22 pilot? A normal C-130 is limited to 155. In wartime, it can go to 175. We were 20,000 pounds over the wartime limit. They're flying a diamond formation in the mountains, penetrating Iranian airspace at night. So had the mission succeeded, they would have easily won the McKay Trophy for that mission that night. So those are some of the competing pressures that were involved. How do you get the squadron ready, and how do you select the people that are going to fly the mission, knowing that they may spend their whole life in special ops and fly in no real world missions except maybe this is their only chance. So that was the big challenge, how to get the right people trained and equipped to fly a mission of national significance, as it turned out to be, of course, a blow to the United States when it failed, but you know the results since then as far as the unintended consequences.
You bet. I'd like to transition to talk about some of the community interaction here. You've spent a lot of time here at the Emerald Coast, your time at Eglin before becoming the commander, and then afterwards as well, up to including now. After the failure, so after we lost the men at Desert One and you came back, what was the community reaction here? How were you received, and what were your thoughts on how that went down?
Very strong support from the community, because as you know, most of the people in the area are retired military or civil service or know somebody that's military, so that was not a problem. It sort of erased any kind of ill feelings from the Vietnam War that somebody might have about the military, and the support has been tremendous ever since. Hurlburt, of course, has had a memorial service every year for 40-something years now, and I've been really appreciative of the fact that those who had the guts to try have not been forgotten. So it was a pleasure to have the community support that we had, and Hurlburt continuing to not let the legacy of those that gave their all, naming streets at Hurlburt, the community, the memorial services. It's been a challenge. It's been a real blessing to be living in Fort Walton Beach and Destin over the years with the people that we have. And of course, as you probably realize, there is now a documentary coming out called Desert One that I participated in, that will probably hit the History Channel anytime now, and that'll help as well.
Talk about some of your leadership challenges after Desert One, sir. Maybe it's sometimes overlooked that there was a second effort that got underway almost immediately afterwards. How did you, as a commander, as a leader, convince the squadron to continue on after you had lost those men at Desert One? What was that like, and how did you succeed in going to the second effort, Honey Badger, and any lessons learned that you could share from that?
Of course, the immediate issue was burying the dead. A lot of complicating factors. Like, for instance, the Iranians sent 9 coffins back, and I was called right away under the carpet. Colonel Guidry, you reported 8 people, and the Iranians sent 9 coffins, so we had to deal with that, dealing with Dover, identifying the remains, working with them. And of course, as you know, 3 could not be identified, had to be buried in a common grave by military law. Went to all the memorial services. The toughest one was, of course, when you had to deal with 3 grieving widows over 1 casket, buried at Arlington. After we went through that round of memorial services and actions, the next issue was testifying before Congress. I went before the Senate Armed Services Committee and the House Armed Services Committee with the other leaders, and they were looking for ways to chastise Jimmy Carter. And that was quite an experience, going before those committees and having my deposition taken and then being grilled by certain senators. One strange thing happened, that kind of a side story. The Senate Armed Services Committee hearing was done in a private room with all the armed service senators that are on the Armed Services Committee around the table. And it went around the table, almost everybody said, well, Congress should have been consulted before you went on this mission. We should have been consulted. We got to Barry Goldwater, and he said, God, that's the worst thing you could have done, to tell Congress ahead of time you were going into Iran. So that was a strange situation. But after we got through with that, then I'm sitting at home on a Saturday morning and I got a telephone call. You're to report to Fort Bragg in 30 days. And I said, what's the assignment? Well, we can't tell you. Just get ready, take care of your affairs. You'll be curtailed as a squadron commander after 17 months rather than the normal 24. And you're going to Fort Bragg. So I reported. There were 2 World War II barracks that were chain linked off with barbed wire on top as our first compound. And that was quite an experience, getting together with people from all the services. But in the interim was Project Honey Badger. Honey Badger was probably in the June, July. I'm getting ahead of myself here. I should have talked about Honey Badger first. Honey Badger was a second attempt to rescue the hostages. The Iranians had not been smart enough to move them around prior to Eagle Claw, but after Eagle Claw, they were smart enough to start dispersing them. So we knew it would be a challenge because we had a fleeting target. But for Honey Badger, all of the Air Force assets possible were at our disposal, like C-5s hauling in Blackhawks and landing in the desert, that kind of stuff. So I was the natural person to handle the C-130, at least, training coordination. We deployed to a base in Texas, a remote base for Honey Badger, and we went through a 4-day cycle. What I mean by that is that we were given a mission profile on day 1. We did individual training on day 2. We did a rehearsal of that mission that was given to us on day 1, on day 3, the night of day 3. And then we recovered the airplanes on day 4, and then we'd repeat that cycle. And the most aggressive one we did was to seize an airfield that looked very similar to the international airport in Tehran, which is Mehrabad Airport. And coincidentally, I had gone to pilot training at Reese Air Force Base. Reese Air Force Base has dual runways, has elevation above sea level similar to Mehrabad, has terrain similar to Mehrabad, so Reese Air Force Base was used. And the highlight of Project Honey Badger was for us to seize Reese Air Force Base in the dead of night twice. We did it on Sunday nights after the airplanes at Reese were secured. And we did it with 14, if I remember right, we had 8 C-130s and probably a dozen C-141s. And the C-141s would come in on the tail end of an airfield seizure. And that's the beginning of the Little Bird mission. And at that time it was the OH-6. And the C-141s would unload the OH-6s and they'd be rebuilt, or the wings, the rotors reattached, whatever you do to a helicopter. And then they would go out and fly a mission profile to rescue the hostages. And the challenge we had was intelligence would tell us that Mehrabad was now guarded by X number of Iranians with these vehicles and these types of weapons. So the intelligence would say, okay, they're going to be positioned here and there. And the Ranger Squadron would tell us, well, here's what we need to neutralize the defenses at Mehrabad Airport. So the only way we could get enough assets to land blacked out fast enough would be to go back to wing flying of the C-130, in other words, on the wing, and have two C-130 MC-131s blacked out, coming down final, and then one peeling off and landing abreast of each other on parallel runways. So we had to get 5 MC-130s down in 30 seconds, which means the first 2 roll to the end, the next 2 stop midfield, and the third one lands short, to get enough Rangers to neutralize the threat. So those are the kinds of things we did, starting from not even knowing how to seize an airfield way back in November, and then doing it with 5 MC-130s in 30 seconds, followed by a string of 141s coming in with minimum lights. In other words, now you could establish portable lights and have the 141s use portable lights to land. So that was the beginning of what was called Sol 2 in the Air Force. In other words, you don't have the capability to land blacked out like an MC-131, but you can land with night vision goggles if there is support on the ground ahead of time. So that was the environment, and of course, being involved in that was probably why I was selected to be a plank holder at JSOC.
Sure.
And the problem with JSOC in the early days was it had really a lot of Army people that really wanted to do things the Army way as far as fighting a war. And it was a challenge, but that turned out to be the beginning of joint operations, really. We only gave lip service to joint operations before that, but we really eventually became a joint outfit.
Yes, sir.
So JSOC for 3 years. As luck would have it, I was reassigned back to Hurlburt to form the test and evaluation unit 6 weeks before Grenada. So I missed out being the air component commander for Grenada. And General Pfister replaced me at JSOC.
Can we touch on the kind of leading the squadron through the disaster? The media, for a large part, painted this as a failure. You talked already about what you faced at Congress with the Armed Services Committees, how they were looking to kind of finger somebody who was responsible for the failure, to place blame. Meanwhile, you know the work that the squadron's put in, that the airmen of the 8th SOS have worked so hard to do. And there's a lot of talk about how it wasn't actually a failure. It was a well-planned mission that happened to fail. How did the men of the squadron react to that, and how did you lead them through that? Were they willing to go after it a second time, or was that a leadership challenge for you?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The immediate thing I did was assign people to help with the families. In other words, I want 4 or 5 people to volunteer to take care of Pam Mayo. I want 4 or 5 people to take care of Jan McMillan, whatever. Do everything you need, cut their grass, get their car oil changed, whatever you have to. And then what we basically did is we were so busy with Honey Badger, and the fact that right after the mission, all of the powers to be in the Pentagon and headquarters TAC realized that the C-130s had done their job and had made the best out of a bad situation by getting everybody out of the desert that night that was still alive. And that the tactics we had developed, primarily airfield seizure and blackout landings, were now so valuable in looking forward for special ops that they had a lot to look forward to as far as what they had done. over the months getting ready for the mission. So honey badger was what diverted our attention from any kind of morale problems. I did have, and I won't disclose the names, but about 2 people that came back and said, because of wife pressure, I really don't want to be involved in a second attempt. I didn't do anything about that, but that always happens. And then, of course, I had to deal with the people that were not selected for the mission that were bitter. A lot of people said this was an all-volunteer force. Well, that's not really the way to look at it. Everybody was a volunteer to start with. You had to pick the ones that you felt gave you the best chance of mission success. So that was the challenges we had initially. And then, of course, when JSOC was formed in August, then the pace of getting ready for a second attempt increased, because now the mission was more difficult because the hostages were being relocated all the time. So we had to really get innovative. There were not enough C-130s in special ops to do the mission. So we had to bring in TAC C-130s from troop carrier squadrons or tactical airlift squadrons and train them in landing with night vision goggles with minimum lights put in, etc. And then we had the other problem with, as you probably realize, at that time there were only 2 Ranger battalions. And any one Ranger battalion at any one time is the ready battalion. So we had to train them, get ready for the next missions, practice airfield seizure, etc. And about that time their 6-month period ended, then we had to start on the next one. So to answer your question, the squadron just was busy as hell with what few assets we had, bringing in other C-130 guys to make them augment us, and training the Ranger battalion. So we were just so busy that didn't decrease when JSOC was formed. It actually got more intense. Thank God we didn't have the problem in the C-130s as we had with the political problems with the helicopters. Because SEAL Team 6 was formed when JSOC was formed. And Richard Marcinko, the commander, really didn't want anything to do with the Air Force helicopters. So we had these political battles to fight that was a challenge. So the short answer to your question is we're busy as hell, and that really helped.
Yes, sir. You've kind of hit at it a couple times, how you did all this as a part of TAC before JSOC existed, before SOCOM existed, before AFSOC as we know it existed.
Right.
The mission in a large part was responsible for that. The mission was responsible for the genesis of the aircraft that I now fly and have the privilege to lead airmen who fly and maintain it. You and your squadron did a ton for SOF as we know it today. What are you most proud of, though, as you look back at the contributions you as an individual and as a unit made to SOF as a whole? If you could just pinpoint one thing, what would it be?
The fact that we had very little equipment that was ready for the mission, that within the squadron we innovated and developed the tactics independent of any kind of support other than Lockheed Ontario. When we had something to do with the airplanes, they pinched in. The fact that we had C-130 pilots and crew members that were the cream of the crop, that had a can-do attitude, that develop the procedures and tactics that were used for 20 years, if not longer. Just the issue of how to land a C-130 blacked out with no lights on the ground, no lights emanating from the airplane that were visible. Do it on the first pass without a go-around. Let me highlight that by one little story, okay? The C-130s that were in the Pacific Squadron, MC-130 Talon 1, had FLIR, but you couldn't put the FLIR turret down and the gear down at the same time, okay? So how do you use a FLIR-equipped airplane to lead an airfield seizure, to land blacked out for the string of airplanes behind you and not make a go-around? Because you can't make a go-around because that alerts the enemy. So you have to guarantee you're going to land on the first pass. Well, I got together with the combat controllers and let's see what we can do. Why don't we take the lead airplane and have him come down final on an airfield seizure with the FLIR turret down, landing gear up. No shooters on board. He's just the pathfinder. And then we take chem lights and we put 5 or 6 of them around a piece of cardboard. And what did we use? The toilet paper. When you finish toilet paper, you got this cardboard. So we strapped chem lights around a dozen toilet paper cardboard rings. So we'd have the FLIR-equipped landing gear up, come down final, using the FLIR to find the runway with the shooters 30 seconds behind in other C-130s. And as we approach the run, we start throwing out these beacons. We tried that. Didn't work. They couldn't see them far enough ahead of time. So the squadron bit the bullet and said, we're just going to develop procedures as to how to use the ancient goggles we have now to make the first airplane land that's got the shooters on board. And how are we going to do that? Who wears goggles? Which pilot? Do you focus on infinity or the runway? What do you do? How do you do it? Okay, the squadron pilots and navigators and the crew members in the 8th developed it. And that was the way it was done for years until technology came in and helped them with heads-up displays and that kind of stuff. But the point is, what I'm most proud of is all of the tactics and procedures we developed by just having the carte blanche to do it and then having the wherewithal to try it and getting it done. But that, getting those 6 C-130s underneath the radar, going into Iran that night at those gross weights, was probably the biggest achievement I can think of.
Sir.
That I'm proud of.
Sounds to me a lot like the first soft truth, brought about after your time, but the fact that humans are more important than hardware.
Right.
That it was the humans in the loop that did all of these things that enabled the mission to even be attempted against long odds, despite the end result.
Right. Now we brought some memorabilia.
I would love to talk about it if you don't mind, sir.
Be glad to.
Yeah. Where would you like to start?
How about the that one?
The order or
The big one.
mission rehearsal? These are all the ones out of the case in the squadron?
Yeah, that.
Yes, sir.
Okay, what this is being an engineer, I was the right person to be sent to Easton Hangar to run the operation as far as coordinating with the Pentagon, and rather than being in one of the seats, okay? I was the right guy, in my estimation. So what I had to do was interpret what Colonel Kyle wanted to do in the next rehearsal. And here's how the rehearsals were conducted. It would always be a 2-night operation, a Friday night and a Saturday night. and we would replicate what the mission needed to do on night 1 on Friday night, and then night 2 on Saturday night. So we would pick an airfield somewhere in the southwest United States with the topography similar to the desert, realizing that we'd prefer to land on a hard surface, obviously, but we had to get ready to transition the mission from the emergency, they're shooting them, go with what you got, to a more deliberate, when the moon is right, when the temperature is right. Okay? So this is an example of what our rehearsals were like. There's all kind of diagrams here with aircraft parking designs, etc. But this is what I prepared to give to the air crews. And it shows who the aircraft commander is, the times, refueling operations, the runway. Indian Springs was used quite a bit. Why? Because Indian Springs in Nevada, I think it's now Creech Air Force Base, had a taxiway and landing similar to the airfield we were going to seize on night 2. We were going to seize an airfield on night 2 on the mission for the transload from the helicopters to the C-130s and the 141s. So we needed an airfield similar to that in the States to rehearse night 2. And Indian Springs was always that airfield. So this is the diagram of Indian Springs. So that's a piece of memorabilia from the rehearsals that I contributed. When it was time for the mission, I had never been once to the Pentagon, ever. And I was naive enough to think that if you're flying a mission of national significance like this, then when you got to your staging base, in this case, Masira Island, Oman, there would be this briefing team from the Pentagon that came down and gave us these mission packages and told us about intelligence and escape and evasion and all that. I was naive enough to think that was going to happen. None of it happened. When we got to Oman, I was given one piece of paper from Colonel Kyle. It says, here's all the times. Takeoff times, refueling times, landing times, and all that. And I said, that's what I give the crews? Yeah. So I had taken notes throughout the preparation on steno pads. So I took 6 pages out of a steno pad and made 6 copies of what the crews would carry with them on the mission. The navigators had their charts, of course. And when we got back from the mission, intelligence confiscated them all except for one. And that was Steve Fleming in number 3. And he gave me his at the end of the mission. So here it is, the original. And that's from Steve Fleming. And that's what the crews carried with them. So the other 5 were burned, 1 survived. Okay? The airfield we were going to seize on night 1, if we did that option, seizing an airfield, was a very tiny airfield. And the parking was going to be very skosh. We could not bring in all 6 C-130s at once. We had to bring in 3 at a time. So we would seize the airfield on night 1 and bring in people that could maintain that airfield in a clandestine manner throughout the next day to try to hide the fact that that airfield had been seized, and night 2 was the actual hit on the embassy. So we had a problem with parking. So somebody came up with a way to give us a piece of metal that was the same size as the runway, scaled to a C-130 and the helicopters, with magnetic pieces on it. So we actually, although we didn't have one exactly to rehearse with, we did a paper tabletop rehearsal with these pieces of cardboard on a metallic runway to see where we could park and turn. That's just typical of what we did. Now the most important one
Yeah, 2 more down
is
here.
probably this one. I was tasked by General Gast, when we came back out of the mission, to call the roll, to find out who got killed. So we got back, we were very deflated, very tired, but I gathered everybody in the tent city and I said, we got to come up with the right list so the wives could be notified. So I'm the one who called the roll and wrote on this piece of paper, KIA, next to the people that got killed. So that's the actual paper I used.
So can you, I think we've probably all heard the story, but it's worth telling again. How did the motto come about, the guts to try?
Yeah. The airfield in Oman had a control tower, and the control tower operators were British citizens, contract workers. So let me back up. You would think that you're flying a mission of national significance, and you're going halfway around the world to deploy and then going in on a 2-night mission, that the U.S. military or whatever would provide air-conditioned shelters, barracks or something, portable with a hot kitchen and all that, to make you at your maximum efficiency to fly this mission. And that didn't happen. What happened is we were told to go to Hurlburt Supply and pick up a mess kit. They hired a carpenter to make an outhouse in Oman. Okay, no portalettes hadn't been invented yet. Mm-hmm. Okay, MREs hadn't been invented yet. So we got cases of sea rations, a tent kit, mess kit, and put them in the back of the airplane, and we were self-sufficient. Okay, so we got there, and on the other side of the runway from the tower, corner of the airfield, we set up a tent city for the crews, C-130 crews. The Delta Force would be flown in on the morning of the mission and keep going that afternoon. So we were the only ones there, the C-130 and our support group. So the British guys observed us coming in. Then on the evening of April 24th, the 6 C-130s leave just about at dusk. And 7 or 8 hours later, 5 come back. So they wondered where the other one was. So they tuned in to Voice of America and BBC. And by that time, President Carter had come on the air. And they somehow got 2 cases of Bass Ale, put them in a pickup truck, drove them around to the runway and dropped them off at our little tent city, and scribbled on the top case of beer, "To you all from us all for having the guts to try." So I took the cardboard flap, put it in my flight suit pocket, brought it back, framed it, put it in the 8th. Then I left for JSOC. It went to the 1st SAL for a while, and then it ended up at HAFSOC headquarters. That's where it is now.
You bet.
And that's the story of the guts to try.
That's awesome. It's our motto to this day, the book, everything that we kind of stand for, so we certainly appreciate that. This is kind of a personal interest of mine. As you look back, all the things you've learned, planning the mission, executing the mission, the things you went on to do after that. If you could go back in time and tell Second Lieutenant Guidry just one thing, give one piece of advice, what do you think that would be?
That's a difficult question. I am not your typical rah-rah fighter pilot personality type. I ain't. I'm more of a planner, an engineer. If I could do anything different, it would have been to have probably taken a more active role at JSOC in dealing with the political issues with the Army and the helicopters and all that, and being a little bit more forceful. But we had a commander, General Schultes, who really respected me. I'm just not a politician. I'm not. But I think that I was probably the right kind of person to have been put at Hurlburt to get the squadron ready. I think I was the right kind of person, because what other commander would have said, no, I'm not going up in Eastern Hangar and run a jock. I'm the commander. Fly me every day and get me proficient so I can be one of the pilots on the mission. I was smart enough to avoid that. And that's probably the two things that I take away from my whole experience. I had flown 110 top secret missions in Vietnam. Every one of them had a special ops profile. Almost every one was more complicated than night one of Eagle Claw. So I think I was qualified from a leadership standpoint, but I wasn't current, I wasn't proficient as a pilot. So I had to deal with the fact that I was brought in as an outsider. Why? Because I came out on the squadron commanders list, and I had been at the squadron managing the rubber duck project. So I was kind of known around Hurlburt as the one who successfully dealt with the SEALs in developing the airdrop of the rubber raiding craft. They call it the rubber duck. So in retrospect, I think the good Lord placed me in that position as the right kind of person to deal with getting the squadron ready. And they performed admirably that night, along with the crews from my fellow squadron from the Pacific. And probably the C-130 aircraft, having my chosen aircraft out of pilot training, suited me rather than being a fighter pilot. So I learned a lot about myself throughout this experience. I just wish the mission had succeeded, but I still look today at all the benefits we have derived. Don't get me wrong, we probably would have the same capabilities we have now, but because the mission failed, and it failed miserably, and two things happened. Number one, we had the failure of the mission, we had the accident. The two together had a synergistic effect that shocked Congress, shocked the Air Force, shocked the military, that said, we neglected special ops after the Vietnam War. Look what's happened. So how we got from the rock bottom to the capability we had by the time I left JSOC, I think is probably the third thing in my favor as far as a satisfaction of having done something to help special ops.
Well, Colonel Guidry, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you for sharing, for your continued involvement with the 8th SOS and SOF. It means a lot to me to be able to sit down and talk with those who have come before, who have really blazed the trail for special operations as we know today. So I appreciate that and look forward to talking to you again sometime soon, sir.
My pleasure.